Rain drummed against the back door of Archie's diner, each drop a small percussion against metal and brick. Callista Morgan clutched her arm where coffee had scalded the skin, blisters already forming in angry red welts. "Please, don't kick me anymore. I'm already hurt," she whispered, her back pressed against the cold brick wall, her voice barely audible above the storm. Inside, through the fogged window, a man in a faded silver shirt set down his spoon with deliberate care. No one in that diner knew he was Silas Harrington, a CEO who had walked away from boardrooms to sit among ordinary people. His next decision would stop a chain of cruelty that had lasted too long and quietly open a road for an entire town that had forgotten what hope looked like. The air inside Archie's diner carried more than the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon. It carried the weight of a town that had seen better days, a Midwestern industrial community where the factories had closed their doors one by one over the past 15 years, leaving Main Street half empty and dreams in short supply. The diner occupied a corner lot at Oak and Third, a relic from the 1950s with cracked vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a checkerboard floor that had lost its shine decades ago, and walls painted a yellow that had faded to the color of old newspapers. But despite its wear, Archie's diner remained the beating heart of the community. It was where truck drivers pulled off Highway 41 at 4 in the morning to nurse black coffee and stare at the darkness before dawn. It was where families scraped together just enough quarters and dollar bills for Sunday pancakes, measuring their week's success by whether they could afford the short stack or had to settle for toast. It was where the unemployed sat for hours over a single cup, not because the coffee was good, but because the warmth was free and no one told them to leave. The diner's interior was a study in contrasts, though few noticed anymore. Inside, the lights cast a warm amber glow, the kind that made tired faces look softer, that forgave the lines and shadows that hardship had drawn. Outside, beyond the rain-streaked windows, the street lay dark and cold, lit only by flickering street lamps that the city could no longer afford to replace. This contrast between inside warmth and outside cold was more than aesthetic. It was the central tension of the place, the invisible line between human kindness and casual cruelty, between those who saw others and those who looked right through them. Callista Morgan moved through the late shift with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. At 32 years old, she had the kind of quiet, unshowy strength that came from years of carrying invisible weight. Her dark brown hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, secured with whatever was handy, a pencil or a rubber band or a clip she had found in the lost and found box. Her apron, once white but now a permanent shade of gray no amount of bleach could fix, had pockets stuffed with order pads, pens that barely worked, and the occasional crayon that her son Finn had slipped in when she was not looking. She had worked the overnight shift at Archie's for nearly 4 years, taking the hours no one else wanted because they paid an extra $1.25 per hour and because her mother could watch Finn while he slept. What set Callista apart, what made regulars ask for her section even when other tables were open, was her uncanny ability to remember. She remembered that old Henry Cho took his coffee black with no sugar, that he had been a machinist at the plant before it closed, that his wife had died 3 winters ago, and he came to the diner because his house was too quiet. She remembered that Miss Vivian preferred her coffee so weak it was barely brown, with extra cream that she would stir for a full minute before taking her first sip. She remembered that the young couple who came in on Friday nights always split a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, not because they were not hungry enough for 2, but because money was tight and they were saving for a baby. She remembered these things not because she had a photographic memory or because the diner required it, but because she understood that being remembered was sometimes the only evidence people had that they mattered. In a world that had mostly stopped seeing them, Callista made sure they were seen. Her 8-year-old son Finn waited for her each night in the storage room that doubled as her break space. A closet really, barely 6 feet by 8 feet, lined with metal shelves holding industrial-sized cans of tomato sauce and bags of flour. Finn would sit on an overturned milk crate, his school backpack beside him, drawing on whatever paper he could find. Receipt tape, napkins, the backs of old menus, torn pieces of cardboard. He drew gardens, always gardens. Flowering vines that climbed invisible trellises, small courtyards blooming with impossible colors, patches of green and gray concrete spaces. Tonight, his latest work sat propped against a dented can of tomatoes. He had sketched the interior of the diner, but transformed. Every booth was surrounded by flowering plants, roses and daisies and morning glories, as if the building itself had been reclaimed by nature. At the bottom, in his careful child's handwriting, he had written, "Mom's Little Garden." The drawing was a splash of color and hope in a space that had neither. Silas Harrington sat in the corner booth, the one with a clear view of the entire dining room, a newspaper spread before him but largely unread. He wore clothes that had been washed and worn too many times, jeans with a small hole in one knee, a work shirt in a shade of silver that had once been crisp white but had faded through countless cycles in a laundromat. The outfit was a deliberate choice, carefully selected to be invisible, to blend into the landscape of working-class America. For 2 weeks, he had been coming to Archie's diner after midnight, always ordering the same meal, scrambled eggs with wheat toast and a side of bacon that was never crispy enough, leaving tips that were neither generous enough to be remembered nor stingy enough to cause offense. He spoke little, smiled when spoken to, paid in cash, and left without fuss. But Silas Harrington was not a late-night regular down on his luck. He was the 36-year-old founder and CEO of a company called Cornerstone Community Capital, a firm that specialized in rescuing failing small businesses. But his method was radically different from the typical private equity playbook. He did not believe in slashing staff, raising prices, or extracting maximum value before flipping the asset. Instead, he believed in finding the decent people who were already doing the invisible work of holding communities together and giving them ownership, resources, and support. His company had a simple philosophy that sounded naive until you saw the numbers. Invest in kind people, create transparent systems, share profits broadly, and measure success not by quarterly returns but by how many lives were made more stable. It worked. His portfolio of community-owned diners, hardware stores, and laundromats across the Midwest had a failure rate of less than 8%, far below the industry standard. But the model required one thing that could not be taught: finding the right person to bet on. That was why Silas went undercover. He needed to see who remained kind when no one was watching, who led without a title, who built dignity into the smallest interactions. Tonight, he would find that person, though the path to discovery would be darker than he had hoped. Archie Williams stood behind the cash register, his tall frame bent by decades of standing in the same spot, shoulders rounded forward as if perpetually bracing against a wind that never stopped blowing. He was 58 years old and had owned the diner for 33 years, having bought it from the original Archie, a man with no children who had liked the young line cook enough to sell him the place for a price he could almost afford. For a long time, it had been a good life. Archie had married his high school sweetheart, Susan, and together they had run the diner, her managing the books while he managed the kitchen. They had never gotten rich, but they had been stable, respected, part of the fabric of the town. Then Susan got sick. Ovarian cancer, stage 4 by the time they caught it. The treatments were aggressive and expensive, and their insurance covered far less than the bills demanded. Archie took out a loan against the diner to pay for experimental treatments that bought Susan an extra 18 months but not a cure. When she died, 5 years ago, she left him with memories and $73,000 in debt. The recession that followed closed half the businesses on Main Street, and foot traffic at the diner dropped by 40%. Archie cut his own salary to nothing, then cut staff hours, then stopped taking vacations or sick days. He deferred maintenance on equipment until things literally broke. The walk-in freezer ran 10 degrees warmer than it should. The fryer needed replacing. The roof leaked in 3 places. He patched and prayed and watched the invoices pile up on his desk like a slow-motion avalanche. He was a good man trapped in a slow financial collapse, too attached to the diner to sell it, too exhausted to save it, and too kind to fire anyone even when every rational voice told him he had to cut deeper. And then there was Ronnie Blake. He came into the diner twice a week, always late at night when the crowd was thin and Callista was working. Ronnie was 42 years old, a man whose own failures had curdled into a kind of ambient meanness. He had worked at the steel mill for nearly 20 years, starting on the floor at 19 and working his way up to shift supervisor by the time he was 35. It had been good work, union work, the kind that came with benefits and a pension and a certain dignity. Then the mill closed. Not gradually, not with warnings or buyouts, but abruptly, announced on a Friday and shut down by Monday. Ronnie had been unemployed for 5 years. He picked up occasional work, roofing in summer, snow removal in winter, but nothing steady, nothing with health insurance or a future. He drank too much, owed too much, and needed desperately to feel bigger than someone. Callista was his favorite target because she never fought back. She could not afford to. Single mothers working overnight shifts at diners did not get to have pride. They got to have jobs, barely, and that was enough to keep them silent. Tonight, Ronnie had come in just after 1 in the morning, already half drunk, his movements exaggerated and loud. He had ordered coffee, black, and let it sit on the table until it went cold. When Callista came by to refill it, he had waved her off with an irritated gesture. "This tastes like dirt," he announced loudly enough for the handful of other customers to hear. Callista had apologized, offered to brew a fresh pot. Ronnie had shaken his head with theatrical disgust. "Just bring me a new cup. Jesus, is that so hard?" She had returned with a fresh cup, and as she set it down, Ronnie had reached out and tipped it deliberately, spilling hot coffee across the table and directly onto Callista's forearm. The liquid was still near boiling, and it hit her skin with vicious heat. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath, but did not scream. The diner went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Everyone looked, and then, almost immediately, everyone looked away. It was the kind of communal cowardice that had become normalized, the unspoken agreement that intervening would only make things worse, that some people were just like that that it was easier to let cruelty happen than to confront it. Archie stood frozen behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge hard enough that his knuckles went white. He wanted to intervene. He wanted to throw Ronnie out, to ban him permanently, to stand up for Callista, who had never missed a shift in 4 years. But Ronnie was a regular customer. He paid his tab, tipped occasionally, and came back week after week. Archie could not afford to lose even one regular customer. The math was brutal and simple. So he stayed behind the counter and did nothing, and hated himself for it. Callista pulled her arm back, cradling it against her chest. Her skin was already turning red, blisters beginning to form in a line where the coffee had run down her wrist. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She whispered an apology, as if the spill had been her fault, as if she had somehow failed to prevent Ronnie from tipping the cup. She grabbed a towel and began mopping up the mess, her burned arm trembling slightly. Ronnie leaned back in his seat, satisfied. He had proven something to himself, reasserted some small measure of control in a life where he had almost none. The moment passed. The diner resumed its low hum of conversation. The world kept turning. Silas Harrington had watched the entire exchange. He had seen the calculation in Ronnie's eyes, the way he had waited until Callista was close enough, the deliberate slowness of the tip. He had seen Callista's shoulders curl inward, her body making itself smaller, trying to take up less space, trying not to provoke further anger. He had seen Archie's paralysis, the war between decency and survival visible on his face. And he had seen every other person in the diner avert their gaze, complicit in their silence. This was the data point that mattered to Silas. Not the revenue per table, or the average check size, or the food cost percentage, but this, the quiet, normalized tolerance of cruelty. It told him everything he needed to know about what kind of business this was, and what it could become if someone intervened. Silas stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the coffee station. He picked up the pot, still warm, and walked to Ronnie's table. Without asking, he refilled Ronnie's cup. Then he reached into his wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table next to Ronnie's plate. The bill covered the cost of Ronnie's meal and a generous tip. Silas's voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried an edge that could cut glass. "That covers your meal and a tip," he said, his eyes locked on Ronnie's. "But it does not buy you the right to humiliate another human being. Nobody pays for that privilege. Not here, not anywhere." Ronnie looked up, startled by the directness, the lack of deference. He opened his mouth, likely to argue, to assert his right as a paying customer to complain. But something in Silas's posture, in the stillness of his stance, stopped him. This was not a man who would back down. This was not someone who could be intimidated or reasoned with or dismissed. The air between them held a line that Ronnie understood instinctively he should not cross. He grabbed his jacket from the booth, muttered something inaudible, and left the diner without finishing his coffee. The door swung shut behind him, the small bell above it chiming once, a single clear note in the silence. The diner exhaled collectively. A woman in the corner booth whispered something to her companion. A trucker at the counter nodded almost imperceptibly. No one said anything directly, but the atmosphere shifted, as if a weight had been lifted, as if the room could breathe again. Callista stood near the counter, still cradling her burned arm. Silas walked over to her, his movements unhurried. He picked up his water glass, dumped the ice into a clean napkin, and twisted it into a makeshift compress. He held it out to her. "For the burn," he said simply. Callista took it, her eyes wary. In her experience, kindness from strangers always came with conditions, with expectations, with debts that would be called in later. But Silas simply stepped back, giving her space. "Thank you," she said quietly, pressing the ice to her skin. The cold was a shock, then a relief. Silas nodded toward the dining room. "You remember how everyone takes their coffee," he observed. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Callista blinked, surprised that he had noticed, surprised that anyone noticed. "It matters to people," she said after a moment, being remembered. "Sometimes it is the only thing that makes them feel like they still exist." "That is leadership," Silas said. "Seeing people, making them visible." Callista looked at him more carefully now, really looked. He did not carry himself like someone down on his luck. His posture was too upright, his words too precise, his gaze too analytical. "Who are you?" she asked. Silas allowed himself a small smile. "Someone who washed dishes on the night shift to pay for school," he said. It was not the full answer, but it was true. He had worked his way through business school doing exactly that, the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift at a 24-hour diner in Chicago, learning more about people and power and systems from that job than from any lecture hall. He knew what it meant to serve people who did not see you, who treated you as furniture, who left messes because they knew someone else would clean them up. After the last customer left and Archie had locked the door, Callista and Silas sat in the corner booth and talked for nearly 40 minutes. Finn had fallen asleep on the milk crate in the storage room, his head pillowed on his backpack, his latest drawing still clutched in one hand. Callista kept glancing toward the back, checking on him, but he slept deeply the way children do when they feel safe. Silas did not reveal his full identity, not yet, but he shared his philosophy with a quiet intensity that suggested this was not theory but lived conviction. He told her about businesses he had helped restructure, not by cutting costs but by investing in people. He explained the concept of an employee stock ownership plan, a legal structure where workers own shares in the company and have voting rights on major decisions. He described the kindness board model he had seen work in other towns, a simple corkboard where people could pay for meals in advance, pinning slips of paper that others could take without explanation or shame. He talked about transparency in pricing, about publishing profit margins so customers understood what they were paying for, about measuring success not in quarterly earnings but in how many people's lives became more stable. Callista listened, her natural skepticism softening into something more dangerous: hope. She had been disappointed too many times to trust easily, but there was something in the way Silas spoke, a groundedness, a specificity, that suggested he was not selling a fantasy. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. Silas leaned forward slightly. "Because I think you could lead it," he said. "I want to run an experiment. For 1 week, you manage the front of house operations. You set the tone, you train the staff, you design the systems. I will observe. If it works, if you can demonstrate that kindness and efficiency are not opposing values, then I have a proposal that could save this place and everyone who depends on it." Callista glanced toward the kitchen where Archie was counting out the register, his movements slow and tired. "And if Archie does not want this?" she asked. "Then I walk away," Silas said simply. "No pressure, no hard feelings. But I think Archie is drowning, and I think you know how to build the life raft." The next morning, Callista stood in front of the small day shift crew with a handwritten chart she had created on a piece of poster board she had found in the storage closet. She had stayed awake until nearly 4 in the morning, designing a system, drinking cup after cup of weak coffee, and ignoring the persistent throb in her burned arm. The system was simple in concept, but required discipline in execution. Every customer interaction would follow a rhythm. Greet the table within 3 minutes of seating, respond to any request within 30 seconds, ask 3 genuine questions to understand what the customer truly needed beyond the literal order. She divided responsibilities clearly. One server would focus exclusively on refills for water and coffee, circulating constantly. Another would watch for elderly customers who needed extra time to read the menu or who struggled to hear over the ambient noise. A third would track dietary restrictions and allergies, maintaining a running log that could be checked quickly. She created a notebook with guests and preferences, written on the cover in careful block letters. Inside, she began logging details. Henry's black coffee with no sugar, Vivian's weak brew with extra cream, the young Friday couple who split the bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. This was not about upselling, not about maximizing check averages. This was about the radical act of treating people as if they mattered, as if their preferences and their presence were worth remembering. On day 2, Callista introduced what she called the kindness board. It was a simple corkboard she had bought at the dollar store, mounted near the entrance where everyone entering or leaving would see it. The concept was borrowed from Silas's description but adapted for Archie's diner. Anyone could pay for a meal in advance, and the cashier would write 1 breakfast or 1 lunch or 1 dinner on a slip of colored paper and pin it to the board. Anyone in need could walk in, take a slip from the board, and hand it to the server. No questions asked. No explanations required. No forms to fill out or proof of hardship demanded. Just food, freely given. Finn had been recruited to decorate the board's border. He had drawn a garden, of course. Flowering vines climbing the edges, small birds perched on branches, the words "You belong here" written in green marker across the top. The board went up before the lunch rush, and by 3 in the afternoon, 7 slips had been pinned. By closing, 2 had been taken. On day 3, Callista held a training session on handling difficult customers. The staff sat in the empty dining room during the dead hour between breakfast and lunch. Callista stood in front of them, nervous but determined, and laid out a 3-step process. First, acknowledge any legitimate mistake on the diner's part without being defensive. If the eggs were cold or the order was wrong, own it immediately and fix it. Second, offer 2 specific solutions rather than vague promises. Not "I'll take care of it, but I can bring you a fresh plate right now," or "I can take this off your bill." Third, and most importantly, protect staff dignity as a non-negotiable boundary. "If someone crosses the line," Callista said, her voice steady, "if they become abusive or demeaning, we do not serve that behavior. We stay calm, we stay professional, but we show them the door. Kindness does not mean being a doormat." One of the younger servers, a 19-year-old named Brittany, raised her hand. "What if Archie does not back us up?" It was the question everyone was thinking. Archie was kind but conflict-averse, and they all knew it. Callista met her eyes. "Then I will," she said. "And if I cannot, then we have learned something important about whether this place can change." By day 5, the rhythm of the diner had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Orders flowed more smoothly. The kitchen received fewer complaints about cold food because servers checked timing more carefully. Tips increased by an average of 18%, not because customers were asked for more, but because they felt seen. The staff stood taller, smiled more genuinely, stopped apologizing reflexively for things that were not their fault. There was a energy, fragile but real, a sense that maybe things could be different. But not everyone welcomed the change. Zane Whitaker arrived on day 6, mid-afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a suit that cost more than most of the diner's staff made in a month. He was 45 years old, sharp-featured, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having been told no. He represented Red Oak Capital, a regional investment fund that specialized in acquiring distressed properties. He had been circling Archie's diner for 8 months, waiting for the owner to finally break. Zane did not want the diner. He wanted the land. The building would be demolished, the lot paved over, converted into parking for the new retail development 2 blocks away. It was a simple equation. The diner generated maybe $60,000 a year in profit, probably less. The land, properly developed, was worth $300,000, maybe more. He sat down with Archie in the cramped office and made his pitch with the practiced ease of someone who had done this dozens of times. "You are exhausted, Archie," Zane said, his voice almost kind. "You have given this place everything, and it has given you nothing back but debt and sleepless nights. Sell now. I will pay off every dollar you owe and give you enough left over to retire. You can rest. You have earned it." Archie looked at the number written on the contract. It was $115,000. After the debts were cleared, he would have maybe $35,000 left. Not enough to retire on, but enough to stop drowning. It was mercy, or something that looked like mercy, but it was also erasure. "What happens to my staff?" Archie asked, his voice rough. Zane shrugged, a small movement of expensive fabric. "Not your concern after closing," he said. "They will find other work." Archie's hands trembled as he held the contract. He wanted desperately to say no, to tell Zane to take his offer and leave. But the weight of $73,000 in debt pressed down on him like a physical force, crushing his lungs, making it hard to breathe. "I need time to think," he managed. "Of course," Zane said smoothly. "But not too much time. This offer expires in 72 hours. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and left the office, leaving the contract on the desk like a loaded gun. News traveled fast in a small town. By evening, rumors had metastasized. Half the town believed the diner was already sold. Some customers stopped coming, assuming the end was inevitable, not wanting to be there for the final gasps. Others came more frequently, suddenly nostalgic for a place they had taken for granted. Ronnie Blake, who had been conspicuously absent since his humiliation, saw an opportunity. He began telling anyone who would listen that new corporate owners were coming, that prices would triple, that all the local staff would be fired and replaced with minimum-wage teenagers. He exaggerated and embellished, driven by a petty desire to see Silas's intervention fail, to prove that nothing really changed. Callista felt the shift like a physical pressure, a storm front moving in. Archie avoided eye contact with her. The staff whispered anxiously in the kitchen. Even Finn sensed something wrong. "Is the garden going away, Mom?" he asked quietly that night as they walked home. Callista knelt down so she was eye level with him. "Not if I can help it, baby," she said. But she did not know if that was a promise she could keep. That night, she found Silas in his usual corner booth, his newspaper once again unread. She slid into the seat across from him without asking. "You knew this was coming," she said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Silas folded the newspaper carefully before answering. "I knew someone would try to exploit the weakness," he admitted. "That is why we need to move quickly. Change only happens in the narrow window before desperation turns into surrender. What do you want to do?" Silas leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "I want to rebuild this place," he said. "Not as Archie's diner, as something new. I want to call it Callista's Table." She stared at him, the words not quite making sense. "I am a waitress," she said. "You are a leader," Silas corrected. "You have spent the past 5 days proving it. Every system you put in place worked. Staff morale is up, complaints are down, and more importantly, people feel cared for. That is not luck, that is skill. Now, I need you to trust me for one more night." The plan Silas laid out was bold and risky, and possibly illegal depending on how the permits worked out. He had not been idle during his 2 weeks of observation. He had been working quietly with an architect and a designer, sketching plans, running numbers, preparing a complete proposal. The diner would be gutted and rebuilt. The harsh fluorescent lighting would be replaced with warm LED fixtures that mimicked sunlight. The cracked vinyl booths would be removed and replaced with comfortable chairs and tables that did not wobble. The walls would be repainted in soft earth tones and covered with local art, photographs of the town's history, and yes, Finn's drawings. The menu would be streamlined but elevated, still affordable but made with better ingredients from local suppliers. Most importantly, the ownership structure would be completely reimagined. Silas's company would hold 40%, providing capital and strategic expertise. Archie would retain 20% and transition to the role of head chef, his decades of institutional knowledge valued and preserved. Callista would receive 20% and the title of general manager, with full operational authority. The remaining 20% would be divided among the staff through an employee stock ownership plan, with shares allocated based on tenure and hours worked. But before any of that could happen, they had to survive one more test. The county health inspector was scheduled to arrive at 8 o'clock in the morning for a routine annual inspection. The timing could not have been worse or more suspicious. At midnight, 3 hours before Callista was due to end her shift, the walk-in freezer alarm went off, a shrill electronic beeping that pierced through the kitchen noise. The temperature display read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. It should have been 34. If the freezer stayed warm for more than 4 hours, everything inside would spoil. Hundreds of dollars of food would have to be thrown away. More critically, if the inspector found spoiled food or a malfunctioning freezer, he could shut them down pending repairs. If they were shut down, Archie would have no choice but to accept Zane's offer. Callista did not panic. She called Oliver Grant, the local mechanic who had fixed her car more times than she could count, always charging her less than the job was worth. Oliver arrived within 15 minutes, toolbox in hand, still in his pajama pants under his work coat. Together they opened the compressor housing and began diagnosing. It did not take long to find the problem. A critical bolt on the compressor had been loosened, deliberately, with a wrench. The threads showed fresh scratches. Someone had sabotaged them. They worked through the night without sleep. Oliver tightened the compressor and tested the system until the temperature began dropping. Callista and the night shift staff moved everything from the freezer into coolers borrowed from 3 neighboring restaurants, packed with every bag of ice they could buy from the gas station down the street. Callista set up her phone and live-streamed the entire process, narrating what they were doing and why, posting it to the diner's rarely used social media page. If someone was trying to spread rumors, she would counter with transparency. Silas, still maintaining his cover as a regular customer, rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside them. He did not direct or manage. He simply hauled ice, washed trays, reorganized shelves. He worked with the quiet competence of someone who had done physical labor and respected it. This was leadership stripped of title and authority, leadership as service. By 7 in the morning, they were ready. The freezer was back to 34 degrees. The food had been preserved. The staff was exhausted but functional. When the health inspector arrived at 8, he found a kitchen that was not only compliant but spotless, organized with a level of care that exceeded code. He walked through every corner, checked every temperature log, examined every storage area. He signed off with a score of 96 out of 100, the highest Archie's Diner had received in over a decade. Word spread through the town's networks with surprising speed. The diner that had been written off was not just surviving but improving. Customers who had stayed away began returning. The morning rush was the busiest it had been in months. That afternoon, Zane Whitaker returned, and this time he was not alone. He brought a lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase full of documents. They sat down with Archie in the office and presented a revised offer. The number was lower now, only $90,000, because the property's value has been affected by recent operational instability. But more than the reduced price, the offer now included implied threats. If Archie did not sell, Zane would file complaints with every regulatory body he could find: zoning violations, health concerns, noise ordinances. He would tie Archie up in legal fees and inspections until the diner bled out. It was not a negotiation. It was extortion dressed in legal language. Callista was taking an order at table 7 when she saw Zane and his lawyer emerge from the office. She saw Archie's face, pale and defeated. She set down her order pad and walked to the center of the dining room. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady. "Can I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" she asked. The diney quieted. Conversation posed. Heads turned. Silas stood from his corner booth and walked to stand beside her. For the first time in 2 weeks, he spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "My name is Silas Harrington," he said. "I am the CEO of Cornerstone Community Capital, a company that invests in community businesses. I have been here for 2 weeks, watching, learning, trying to understand what makes this place matter. And I found the answer. It is not the building or the menu. It is the people. Specifically, it is her." He gestured to Callista. Every eye in the room turned to her. She felt her face flush, felt the weight of attention, but she did not look away. Silas continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to boardrooms but stripped of corporate jargon. "I am proposing that we rebuild this diner under a new model. It will be called Callista's Table. Ownership will be shared. My company will hold 40%, providing capital, strategic support, and access to our network of suppliers. Archie will retain 20%, and move into the role of head chef, where his expertise and legacy will be honored. Callista will hold 20% and serve as general manager, with full authority over operations. The remaining 20% will be divided among the staff through an employee stock ownership plan. Every person who works here will own a piece, will have voting rights, will share in the profits. He paused, letting that sink in. Decisions will be made transparently. We will publish our costs and our margins so everyone knows where their money goes. Prices will remain stable for the first year. We will maintain the kindness board and expand it. Every Friday, we will host a free community meal, no questions asked. This will not be a charity. This will be a business built on the principle that when you take care of people, they take care of you. Silas turned to face Zane Whitaker, who stood near the office door, his lawyer beside him. You offered money, Silas said. I am offering ownership. You offered an exit. I am offering a future. Then Silas did something unexpected. He walked to the counter and pulled out a small wicker basket filled with colored index cards, green and red. But this is not my decision to make alone, he said. It belongs to everyone who has a stake in this place. If you have eaten here, if you have worked here, if you have delivered supplies here, you get a vote. Green means you want us to move forward with this model. Red means you want Archie to take the buyout offer. No judgment either way. Just honesty. He placed the basket on the counter next to a clear plastic box. Take a card, vote, put it in the box. In 10 minutes, we will count them together. For a moment, no one moved. Then Archie walked forward. His hands were shaking, but his face had something it had not had in months, the hope. He took a green card and dropped it into the box. The staff followed, one by one. Green cards fell like leaves. Customers stood from their tables and voted. The delivery driver from the bakery, who had just dropped off tomorrow's bread, voted green. A woman who had taken a slip from the kindness board that morning voted green, tears running down her face. Ronnie Blake stood near the door, watching. He had come intending to disrupt, to mock, to tear down whatever Silas was building. But as he watched the votes accumulate, watched a community choose to believe in itself, something broke open in him. He thought about the $20 bill Silas had left, the quiet way he had been shown the door without being humiliated. He thought about how Callista could have cursed him, could have demanded an apology, could have made a scene, but instead she had simply absorbed his cruelty and kept working. He thought about the man he used to be, before the mill closed, before the drinking, before he had turned his pain outward. He walked forward and took a green card. His hand hovered over the box. Then he dropped it in. Callista saw him and walked over. She pulled a slip of paper from the kindness board, one that read one dinner, and handed it to him. Someone paid for this, she said quietly. It is yours if you want it. Ronnie looked at the slip, his vision blurred. Why? He managed. After what I did, Callista met his eyes. Because you are still worth remembering, she said. They counted the votes at the counter, Silas and Callista and Archie together, pulling cards from the box one at a time. 53 green, 0 red. It was not even close. It was unanimous. Zane Whitaker stood near the door, his lawyer already packing the briefcase. This is not over, Zane said. But his voice lacked conviction. He had lost, and he knew it. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a final, defeated chime. The room erupted, but not with triumphant cheering. It was quieter than that, more profound. It was the sound of people exhaling after holding their breath for too long. It was relief and gratitude and cautious joy. Archie shook Silas's hand, then pulled him into a hug. Finn ran from the storage room, where he had been watching, and wrapped his arms around his mother's waist. Ronnie Blake stood by the kindness board, one hand pressed against the drawing of vines, crying silently. 6 months later, Callista's table hummed with steady, sustainable life. The renovation had been completed on time and under budget. The interior glowed with warm lighting that made tired faces look human again. Comfortable seating replaced the broken booths. The walls were covered with photographs of the town's history. The old steel mill in its heyday, the first Archie who had opened the diner in 1953, the Little League teams that had celebrated championships here, the couples who had gotten engaged in these booths. And everywhere, scattered throughout, were Finn's drawings. His little garden painting hung by the entrance, a burst of color that greeted everyone who walked in. The kindness board was restocked every week. At last count, 317 meals had been paid forward. Lunches for school children whose families were struggling were quietly covered through partnerships with the elementary school. Elderly customers had tables with small brass plaques bearing their names, reserved for them every day at the same time. The Friday community meal drew between 40 and 60 people every week. No questions, no applications, no means testing, just food and dignity. The staff had completed a formal training program that Silas's company had developed. Callista was officially general manager, earning a salary of $48,000 a year plus her ownership stake. Archie ran the kitchen with renewed energy, experimenting with new recipes, mentoring younger cooks. His debt had been cleared, and for the first time in 5 years, he slept through the night. Silas stopped by once a month, always ordering the same meal, always leaving the same modest tip, always treated like any other regular. Ronnie Blake had enrolled in a recovery program at the county clinic. He attended meetings 3 times a week and had been sober for 4 months. He worked part-time for the diner, doing maintenance and repairs, fixing the things he had once tried to break. He had replaced the bolt on the freezer compressor and installed a small plaque above it that he had made himself in a metalworking class. It read, "A place's value is measured by how it makes you feel valuable." 3 neighboring towns had reached out, asking if the Callista's table model could be replicated. Silas and Callista were drafting a franchise framework, but it was strict. Every new location had to commit to maintaining a kindness board, an ESOP structure with at least 20% employee ownership, transparent pricing, and a weekly community meal. It was not about scaling for profit, it was about scaling a model of dignity. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Callista stood near the entrance and watched the dining room. Finn sat at a corner table, working on his newest drawing. This one showed a tree with deep roots and wide branches, each branch holding a different scene, people eating together, children playing, workers shaking hands. He was calling it the community tree. An elderly couple shared a pot of tea and a basket of biscuits. A construction worker in dusty jeans read the newspaper over eggs and bacon. A young mother sat in the booth by the window, nursing a baby, a small sign on the table reading "Reserved for families," ensuring she had space and privacy and would not be rushed. Sunlight poured through the clean windows, catching the edges of Finn's painting by the door, making the painted garden seem to glow. Callista felt something unfamiliar, contentment. Not happiness, exactly. This was not a fairy tale. There would be hard days ahead, equipment that would break, customers who would complain, bills that would be tight, but it was real. They had taken cruelty and transformed it into care. They had taken silence and turned it into voice. They had proven that dignity was not a luxury or a bonus. It was the foundation of everything. The door opened, the small bell chiming. A young man walked in, maybe 22 or 23, wearing a wrinkled shirt and carrying a backpack that looked like it held everything he owned. He stood in the doorway, uncertain, looking around as if expecting to be turned away. Callista recognized that look. She had worn it herself, not so long ago. She grabbed a menu from the hostess stand and walked over, meeting his eyes with a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome to Callista's table," she said. "You are exactly where you belong."